Iranians are more believable, more credible. Okay? And the reason why is that the Iranians have to be very strategic in their response to the Americans and the Israelis. And the reason why is the Americans and the Israelis have military dominance over Iran. But just because you have military dominance does not mean you'll win the war. Okay? So what I believe is that Iran and Israel are committed to a war. And it's going to take time to build up to the ground invasion. But just because the Americans and the Israelis attack Iran does not mean they will win. Okay? And the reason why is that, as you know from your research, in 2002, the Americans actually tried to invade Iran. Okay? They ran a simulation called the 2002 Millennium Challenge. And the idea is, let's pretend that we will invade Iran and let's see what happens. So they divide the military into two teams, right? Team USA and Team Iran. Now, if you know anything about the American military, you will know that it is the most dominant, powerful military ever to exist in human history, okay? It is crazy powerful. If the entire world were to get together and say, let's go fight the United States, the world would lose. The United States has the most powerful military in the entire world, okay? And Iran, it's a very poor country. So the United States invaded Iran, and they wanted to see what would happen. And it turned out that, who won? Iran won, okay? And the reason why Iran won is the idea of asymmetrical warfare. All right? And this is a very important idea that you must know if you are to understand this conflict. So what is asymmetrical warfare? All right, let's pretend that Jack and I are enemies. We hate each other and we want to kill each other, okay? Jack has armor and he has a machine gun. I have nothing, okay? So in most battles, Jack's going to kill me, right? But let's pretend that I live in a dark forest. And it's really hard to see in this dark forest, but I've been living there for decades, okay? So I know this dark forest very, very well. So if Jack attacks me in this dark forest, then it's possible for me to win because I can set traps, right? I can play tricks on Jack. And that's the idea of asymmetrical warfare, okay? Even though Jack is superior, because I'm inferior, I'm forced to be much more strategic in how I fight against Jack, okay? And so asymmetrical warfare means that as long as you can define the terms of engagement, as long as you can control how the war is fought, you will win. Okay? So let's look at what this means for Iran and the United States. So the United States has these aircraft carriers, and they cost like $1 billion, okay? They're very expensive, but they're very powerful. Now, in a symmetrical warfare, what would happen is Iran sends its entire navy against this one aircraft carrier of the United States. And then what happens? The United States blows up the entire Iranian navy, okay? That's what would happen. So you don't do that, okay? You do not send your navy against an American aircraft carrier. What you do instead is you send drones, okay? Or drone swarms. So what they did in the Millennium Challenge was they had these suicide boats, right? Charging these aircraft carriers. And guess what, guys? If there's a lot of them, like 1,000 of them, you can't stop all of them. And if one hits, then your boat sinks. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, this is what we call asymmetrical warfare. Now, what's important to understand is that in asymmetrical warfare, you have to control how much resources you use, okay? So, for example, this aircraft carrier costs like $1 billion. The drone swarms, okay, a drone may be $1,000 for a real one, okay? But then you have fake ones that cost $100. $1,000 are these drones that blow up, right? $100 are drones that don't blow up, right? You have 1,000 of these, and then that's like $10 million. And then you have 10,000 of these, and that's another $10 million, okay? So it'll cost you maybe $20 million to blow up a $1 billion aircraft carrier. Okay, does that make sense? And this is why Iran would win a war, because Iran would employ asymmetrical warfare, drone swarms against the American aircraft carriers. Okay? And the true promise actually showed us that the Iranians would probably use this strategy. And the reason why is that the total package, the strike package that the Iranians use, cost about $10 to $30 million. But how much money did the Israelis spend to bring down these drones? Do you guys know? How much did it cost the Israelis to defend themselves against this attack? Okay, it was at least $1 billion. Okay, do you understand? All right. So this shows us that in a war, Iran would use asymmetrical warfare, and and even though Israel and the United States have military dominance, they may not be able to win this war. Okay. Okay. So does this make sense so far? Any questions about this?
So the Israelis and Americans don't have asymmetrical warfare.
Okay, that's a really good question. Okay. And the question really is, okay, listen, the Iranians will use this asymmetrical warfare strategy against the Americans. And so shouldn't the Americans respond with more strategic thinking? And that's a great question. And the answer is the Americans would not do that. Why not? Why is it that asymmetrical warfare is so effective against empires and dominant military powers? What's the problem of empires usually? What is their biggest problem? What is their fatal flaw?
They have too much bureaucracy.
Okay, they have too much bureaucracy, but Iran also has bureaucracy. But the empires have a much bigger problem, okay? Now let's go back to the Millennium Challenge. Now, in the first test, in the first battle, Iran won against the United States, right? So what did the United States do? And do what? They did it again. They did another second. They did a second simulation. In the second simulation, what did they do?
It was scripted.
Exactly. Okay. What the Americans said is, nope, this is cheating, guys. Did you understand? Asymmetrical warfare is cheating. You cannot cheat. And then the Americans won. Does that make sense? Okay. So remember, in the first instance, where you are allowed to use asymmetrical warfare, the Iranians won. In the second instance, the Americans said, no, asymmetrical warfare is cheating. So you're not allowed to use asymmetrical warfare. You must fight us directly. And the Americans won. What does this tell us about the American military?
They're like not flexible.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay. They are inflexible. Empires are inflexible. And the reason why is the idea of hubris, right? If you're an empire, you refuse to admit your failings and faults. You become very stubborn, okay? So it's back to the example of Jack has his machine gun, his armor, right? He comes in the Stark Force thinking like, I'm invincible, right? And like everyone's like, Jack, don't go into that dark forest. It's stupid. But Jack's like, no, I have a machine gun. I don't care. All right? So that's the situation. That's why asymmetrical warfare is so effective, because it allows you flexibility and creativity. And the empire, the dominant power, refuses to be flexible and creative. Okay, does that make sense? All right, and so the classic example of this is Vietnam, where the Vietnamese were clearly dominated by the Americans, but the Vietnamese were using extremely creative and flexible tactics against Americans, whereas the Americans insisted on their main military doctrine. Okay, does that make sense? All right, great. Okay, any more questions? That was a great question. Thank you. Any more questions before we move on? Okay, so now I want to talk about, okay, if the Iranians are going to use asymmetrical warfare, what would it look like? And the answer is this. When the Americans invade, okay, the war started. Before the invasion, the Iranians must do 4 things if it is to prevail in the war, okay? And this is what we call the Iran strategy matrix. Okay? The Iran strategy matrix means that from now on, everything they do must fit into the strategy matrix. Okay? It must accomplish the objectives of the strategy matrix. So the first thing it must do is unite the population. Okay? Second thing it must do is build alliances. And the third thing is win global opinion. And the fourth is weaken the enemy. Okay? So, in other words, everything that Iran is going to do from now until the actual invasion will be to accomplish all 4 goals at once. And it must, if it is to survive a full-scale American invasion. Okay? Does it make sense? All right. So, unite the population. What does this mean? Okay? It means that you win the war depending on how much your population is willing to resist the invasion. And it turns out that even though the Iranians right now are divided, okay, there's a lot of opposition towards the current government in Iran. As some of you know, there have been some protests over the past few years, women protesting for more rights in Iran, okay? So there's a lot of division in that country. But I think that most Iranians would resist an invasion. And the reason why is that the Iranians have a very bad history with Westerners, okay? So the example is the 1953 coup d'etat, okay? So what happened is that in 1909, the British discovered oil in Iran. It was called Persia back then. And so they created a company called the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, which we now know as British Petroleum, okay? BP. And the idea is that this company would be responsible for extracting and selling all the oil. But unfortunately, the deal was that Iran, Persia, would only get 16% of profits. Okay? They only got 16% of profits. So the Iranians are very upset about this. It's their oil, it's their resource, but they're not getting that much money out of it, okay? It's basically stealing. So for decades, the Iranians have been trying to renegotiate the deal. In 1953, the democratically elected government of Iran said to the British, listen, let's do 50-50. Okay, that's fair, 50-50. 50% for us, 50% for you, right? That's a fair deal. And the British, instead of saying yes, went to the Americans, and the British and the Americans together launched a coup d'etat against the democratically elected government of Iran and installed a police state called the Shah. Okay, the Shah, which is like the monarchy, okay? And the Shah, the king of Iran, was so brutal that he created a police state. In 1979, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah, okay? And so the Iranian people do not like the idea of foreign invaders coming in and controlling the resource, okay? Does that make sense? So over time, as Israel and as America continues to be aggressive towards Iran, the population will start to coalesce and fight against the Americans, okay? So that's unite the population. Second is build alliances. Now, Iran has two layers of alliance. The first layer is called the axis of resistance, right? Which I asked you to research. And the axis of resistance includes the Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen. Okay? Now, what's important to understand is that this is not an alliance. What's important to understand is that this is an alliance. Okay? They agree to fight together because they have common interests, which is to remain independent of American influence. Okay? But that does not mean that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis take orders from Iran, okay? They're not controlled by Iran. Iran supports them militarily and financially, but Iran cannot completely control their behavior. Okay? So the example is, on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack against Israel, right? Which resulted in this war. And Iran says, we were not involved. And Israel says that can't be true because you control Hamas. All right? So that's the first layer of alliance. But what Iran needs to do, if it is to win the war, is also bring in Russia and China. Okay? Russia wants the United States to fight Iran. Why?
To weaken the U.S.
Yeah, but true. To distract and weaken the United States, and also to move the attention away from Ukraine, right? Does that make sense? Because Russia is about to win the war in Ukraine, and if there's a war in Iran, then the United States will be forced to divert resources away from Ukraine into Iran, okay? What would Russia bring to the table? Russia will probably not deploy soldiers, okay? But what Russia would do is say to the United States, when you invade Iran, you are not allowed to use tactical nuclear weapons, okay? You understand? Russia would say that, hey, United States, if you use nuclear weapons against Iran, we will use nuclear weapons against you, okay? So basically, Russia would limit the military options of America in a war, which would be of tremendous benefit and advantage to Iran. Okay, does that make sense? China needs to help Iran. Why? What does Iran have that China really needs? What does Iran have that China really, really needs? It really needs this. The Chinese economy needs what? Oil, right? So basically, China can afford for the United States to take over both Iraq and Iran, because then it can control the energy supply to China. Okay, does that make sense? So China would involve itself over time in order to make sure that it's able to obtain oil from the Middle East. China right now is getting most of its oil from the Middle East. Okay? But it will take time for Russia and China to get themselves involved. For Russia and China to get themselves involved in this conflict, Iran must prove two things. What are these two things? What must Iran show to China and Russia in order to get China and Russia involved in this conflict? If you're China and Russia, you're an investor, right? Why will I invest in you, Iran? Why?
Because they can win.
Exactly, okay? So the first thing is, we will fight. Second thing is, we will win. Okay? So this will take time for Iran to prove this to Russia and China. And the more that Iran can show it can win, the more that China and Russia will invest in Iran. both financially and militarily and politically. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so this will take time. And the third thing is win global opinion. So how will Iran win global opinion? What's happening right now that's helping Iran win global opinion, basically? What's happening in the world right now that is helping Iran win global opinion? Or why is the world becoming more supportive of Iran? What thing is happening right now that is outraging or angering the world?
Israel, attacking Iran.
What's happening right now? What's Israel doing right now that is outraging the world? Yeah, Gaza, okay? So this is really important for Iran. It must maintain the world spotlight on Gaza, okay? Because what's happening in Gaza, it's basically genocide, right? Where the Israelis are committed to solving the Palestinian problem once and for all. And that basically means removing the Palestinians from Gaza. They can go to Egypt, they can go to Jordan, it doesn't matter, okay? But the Israelis want them out of Gaza, okay? And so this will go on for many, many years. And as long as the attention is on Gaza, then people will become much more sympathetic towards Iran over time. Okay? If you've been following the news about America, there have been major protests at Yale and at Columbia and other universities about what's happening in Gaza, okay? All right. And the last is weaken the enemy. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that when the United States invades Iran, 2 years from now, 6 years from now, who knows? But when it does so, it wants to build a large coalition of forces. Okay, because then it gives itself legitimacy, right? So this coalition will consist of NATO, Middle East countries, right? And Israel, Saudi Arabia, many countries. And what Iran needs to do is create conflict and dissent in this coalition. Okay? And the way it does that is by building up internal dissent. Okay? Does that make sense? There are many people, most people in America do not support a war against Iran. And so Iran needs to encourage this internal dissent. Okay? It can also create conflict between NATO and the United States, okay? Because obviously America will want NATO involved in its invasion of Iran, but why would France and Germany want to involve itself, right? Okay, does that make sense? So these are the four major goals of Iran. And it must accomplish all four goals if it is to survive an invasion, okay? So from now on, everything that Iran does will be to accomplish all four goals, okay? And this is part of asymmetrical warfare.